On Walter Crane's farm, Henry Johnson endured relentless humiliation, dismissed as too slow. But behind his quiet resolve was a plan. Months later, Henry's thriving farm, built from the lessons Walter mocked, would spark envy, conflict, and a reckoning Walter never saw coming. What Henry did next will leave you speechless. But let's start at the beginning. In the heart of Lawrenceville, a sleepy yet industrious farming town, Walter Crane's farm stood as a beacon of success. Its sprawling fields stretched toward the horizon, neatly divided into rows of corn, wheat, and seasonal vegetables. The land was well irrigated and maintained by an army of workers who knew the farm's reputation all too well. Walter's operation was the envy of nearby farmers, thanks to its unmatched efficiency and high yields. But beneath the pristine surface lay a work environment ruled by fear and intimidation. Walter Crane himself was a man of sharp contrasts. He was in his late 50s, with a sturdy build and a face weathered by years under the sun. His salt and pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him an air of authority that he wielded like a weapon. Walter's deep-set eyes, however, betrayed a perpetual dissatisfaction, a man who saw flaws in everything and everyone. For all his expertise in farming, Walter lacked one essential quality: compassion. His workers knew this too well. On a scorching Monday morning, the kind where the sun seemed to boil the air itself, Walter's voice already echoed across the fields, barking orders before the first crops were even harvested. The heat pressed heavily on the workers, but they dared not complain. Walter's wrath was as relentless as the summer sun. That morning, a new worker joined the crew. Henry Johnson, a middle-aged black man with broad shoulders and a quiet demeanor, was introduced briefly by the foreman before being sent to the cornfields. Henry was the kind of man who carried himself with quiet strength, his movements deliberate and steady. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone commanded respect. But on Walter's farm, respect was a one-way street. Henry's task was clear: harvest as much corn as possible before the end of the day. The field stretched endlessly before him, and the oppressive heat made the work even more grueling. Yet, Henry worked methodically, carefully ensuring each ear of corn was plucked cleanly to avoid damaging the stalks. To Henry, doing the job right was just as important as doing it quickly. But Walter Crane didn't see it that way. As the day wore on, Walter's sharp gaze landed on Henry. From the edge of the field, he watched the new worker's measured pace with growing irritation. The rows behind Henry were neat and orderly, but to Walter, they were far too short for the hours that had passed. Walter's anger began to bubble, and it wasn't long before he stormed over, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. "What's taking you so long, Johnson?" Walter barked, his voice cutting through the rustling of the cornstalks. His tone was loud enough for the other workers to hear, making them pause briefly before hurrying back to their tasks, eager to avoid his ire. Henry paused, straightening his back as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His calm eyes met Walter's fiery glare. "I'm doing my best, sir. Just trying to make sure the job's done right." "Done right?" Walter sneered, stepping closer. His tone was laced with condescension. "At this rate, we'll lose half the crop before it's even picked. Maybe this isn't the job for you. Maybe you should go back to whatever you were doing before." The insult hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. Walter's voice was loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, and several workers cast quick, sympathetic glances in Henry's direction before focusing intently on their own tasks. The unspoken rule on Walter's farm was clear: don't draw attention to yourself, or you'll be the next target. Henry, however, stood firm. His expression didn't waver, though a muscle in his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "I'll pick up the pace, sir," he said evenly, refusing to stoop to Walter's level. Without waiting for a response, Henry turned back to his row and continued working, his movements just as deliberate as before. Walter scoffed and stormed off, muttering under his breath about incompetence. But as he walked away, a flicker of unease passed through the workers who had witnessed the exchange. Unlike others before him, Henry hadn't cowered or argued. He had stood his ground with quiet dignity, and that, more than anything, left an impression. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Henry kept working, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't the end of Walter's scrutiny, but he also knew something Walter didn't. He had a plan. And soon enough, Lawrenceville would learn that the man Walter Crane thought he had humiliated wasn't a failure. He was planting the seeds of his own success. Henry endured Walter's tirades with a quiet resilience that puzzled and, in a way, infuriated the farmer even more. Day after day, Henry showed up to work, methodically completing his tasks, never once snapping back or showing signs of breaking under the pressure. But at sundown, as the other workers trudged home exhausted and disheartened, Henry's real work began. Each evening, Henry returned to his modest home at the edge of Lawrenceville and pulled out books, notebooks, and a laptop. His kitchen table was covered with dog-eared volumes on sustainable agriculture, crop rotation, and soil restoration. Late into the night, he pored over articles and diagrams, sketching plans in his journal. The reason for his slow pace on the farm wasn't incompetence, it was intentional. Henry treated each day on Walter's fields as a lesson, observing the way crops were planted, how the irrigation system operated, and what techniques worked, or didn't. Henry's keen eyes took in every detail: the spacing of the corn rows, the timing of watering schedules, and even the subtle mistakes that led to wasted resources or diminished yields. What Walter saw as a slacking worker was, in reality, a man conducting field research. By the time Henry laid his head on the pillow each night, his journal was filled with notes that would soon change his life. As weeks turned into months, Henry's side project began to take shape. On weekends, while most of the town rested, Henry worked tirelessly on small plots of land he had quietly purchased on the outskirts of town. The land was cheap for a reason: dry, rocky, and considered barren by the locals. When word got out about Henry's purchases, the news spread like wildfire. "Did you hear what that Johnson guy's up to?" one man at the local diner said, shaking his head. "He's buying up land no one wants. What's he gonna do with that? Build sandcastles?" "Probably trying to plant corn in a rock garden," another laughed. "Good luck with that." The jokes didn't bother Henry. He had long learned to tune out skepticism and ridicule. Instead, he focused on preparing the soil. He studied composting techniques, collected organic waste from local restaurants, and enriched the barren dirt with nutrients. Slowly, the once dry and lifeless plots began to transform. Wildflowers appeared first, followed by patches of green shoots. Each weekend brought small victories as Henry experimented with seeds that could thrive in challenging conditions, testing the limits of what others deemed impossible. For Henry, this project wasn't just about growing crops, it was about creating something sustainable, something his community could be proud of. His methods were meticulous, blending modern agricultural practices with the wisdom passed down from his grandfather, a farmer who had taught him that even the poorest soil could yield life if treated with patience and care. Henry's growing ambition didn't go unnoticed. A few curious neighbors stopped by to watch him work. "What are you doing out here, Henry?" asked Mrs. Grayson, a widow whose property bordered one of his plots. "I thought this land was useless." Henry wiped his brow, smiling as he looked over the freshly tilled rows. "It's not useless, ma'am. It just needs a little love and the right touch." Mrs. Grayson nodded thoughtfully, but didn't seem convinced. Still, she appreciated Henry's optimism. "Well, I hope you prove us all wrong," she said, before heading back to her house. Though many doubted him, Henry's determination never wavered. His evenings were spent refining his strategies, and his weekends were devoted to building the farm from the ground up. Quietly and methodically, Henry was laying the foundation for a revolution in Lawrenceville, one that Walter Crane, in all his arrogance, never saw coming. Months passed after Henry quietly left Walter's farm, slipping away without so much as a goodbye. For Walter, it was just another day. The loss of a single worker barely registered in his mind, especially one he'd considered slow and incapable. Walter's focus was elsewhere, berating the rest of his crew, micromanaging their every move, and ensuring his farm remained the most profitable in Lawrenceville. But whispers began circulating around town, rumors that started as faint murmurs and soon grew louder. "Did you hear about Henry Johnson?" the clerk at the general store asked a customer. "They say he's running his own farm now, selling at the Saturday market." Walter overheard snippets of these conversations while picking up supplies, but he dismissed them outright. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "Henry Johnson couldn't grow weeds, let alone run a farm." It wasn't until a few weeks later that the rumors grew too persistent to ignore. One afternoon, Walter's wife returned from the market with a basket of vibrant tomatoes and lush greens. "You won't believe this, Walter," she said, holding up the produce. "These are from Henry's stall. He's got a farm now, and everyone's talking about how incredible his crops are." Walter snatched a tomato from the basket and inspected it. The deep red fruit was firm, its skin smooth and flawless. For a moment he felt a pang of unease, but quickly pushed it aside. Probably some fluke. He won't last a season." Despite his bravado, curiosity gnawed at Walter. That weekend, he made his way to the bustling market, determined to see this supposed farm for himself. He strode through the crowd, the usual vendors greeting him politely, until he spotted the stall causing all the commotion. Henry's booth was surrounded by eager customers. Neatly arranged rows of produce gleamed in the sunlight: tomatoes, peppers, squash, and even fresh herbs tied in small bundles. Each item looked like it had been plucked straight from a gardening magazine. Walter's jaw tightened as he pushed his way closer. Behind the stall stood Henry, a calm smile on his face as he chatted with customers, answering questions about his growing methods and offering tips for using the produce. Henry's friendly demeanor and infectious enthusiasm drew people in, and the line for his stall stretched down the row. Walter's shock turned to fury when he overheard snippets of conversation from familiar faces in the crowd. "I used to work for Walter Crane," one man said to a friend, holding up a basket of Henry's cucumbers. "But Henry? He's different. He actually listens to his workers and teaches us things. It's not just about work, it's about learning." Another woman chimed in. "I've never felt this appreciated on a farm before. Henry treats us with respect, and look at these results." She gestured to the overflowing display of produce, her smile wide. Walter's blood boiled. His fists clenched as he watched former employees, people he'd once berated and dismissed, singing the praises of a man he had mocked relentlessly. Henry wasn't just running a farm, he was building something Walter never had: a community. Unable to contain himself, Walter stomped up to the stall. "So, Johnson," he said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "guess you finally learned to pick up the pace." Henry looked up, unbothered by Walter's presence. "Good to see you, Mr. Crane," he said with a polite nod. "How can I help you today?" Walter sneered, gesturing to the produce. "Didn't think you had it in you. This some kind of miracle, or did you hire someone to do the real work?" Henry met Walter's gaze steadily, his calm confidence unshaken. "No miracles here, just hard work and some lessons learned along the way," he said. "I appreciate the time I spent on your farm, Mr. Crane. It taught me a lot about what not to do." Walter's face flushed, but before he could retort, a customer called out, "Henry, I need some of those peppers." Henry turned away from Walter without another word, tending to the line of customers who clearly valued him. Walter stormed away, his mind racing. For years he'd believed his harsh methods were the key to success, but Henry's thriving operation was proof of something he refused to admit: respect, fairness, and the willingness to learn could achieve far more than fear and intimidation. For the first time, Walter Crane realized that his reign as the town's top farmer was under threat, and he had no one to blame but himself. Desperate to understand how Henry had turned a seemingly worthless piece of land into a successful farm, Walter visited Henry's property under the guise of friendly competition. As he drove up the dirt road, he saw neatly planted rows of crops, innovative irrigation systems, and workers who smiled as they worked. Henry greeted Walter at the gate with a calm yet knowing smile. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Crane." Walter struggled to keep his composure. "How'd you pull this off? I thought you didn't have what it takes." Henry chuckled. "Well, I learned a lot on your farm, Mr. Crane, watching what worked and what didn't. And unlike you, I've learned to invest in people, not just profits." Walter's face turned red as Henry's workers passed by, nodding respectfully at their boss. For the first time, Walter realized his own workers had never looked at him with that kind of admiration. As the weeks went by, Henry's farm continued to grow, even attracting contracts with larger distributors. Walter's farm, on the other hand, began to struggle. Workers quit, and customers complained about the quality of his produce. In the end, Walter was forced to reckon with the fact that his harshness had driven away not just his best workers, but also his reputation. Henry, now a respected figure in Lawrenceville, became a symbol of perseverance and dignity. His success wasn't just a victory for him. It was a lesson for the entire community about resilience and the power of respect.